Hello and welcome to another episode of Friendly Friday, a weekly series where we take a look at budget, standard or modern decks and take them through a friendly league on Magic Online. This week we're taking a look at Sultai Selfmill in Modern, which is a blue, black and green graveyard deck that tries to mill itself to reap the benefits. And one of the key cards in the deck is Varolz, the Scar Striped, which is a 3-mana 2/2 that says each creature card in your graveyard has Scavenge, and the Scavenge cost is equal to the mana cost. And of course, Scavenge means you get to exile the creature from your graveyard and then put a number of +1/+1 counters on one of your target creatures equal to the exiled creature's power. The combo with Varolz is that we're also playing Death's Shadow, which is a 1-mana 13/13 that gets -X/-X, where X is your life total. But unlike the other Death's Shadow decks in Modern, we're not trying to cast the Death Shadow and reduce our own life total. Instead, we're just going to put the Death Shadow in the graveyard, and then we can scavenge it with Varolz, and we just have to pay single black mana, because that's Death Shadow's mana cost, and then we get to put 13 +1/+1 counters on one of our target creatures, which of course for 1 mana is a bargain. And then Varolz also can regenerate if we sacrifice another creature, which is nice, as then we can keep Varolz alive to scavenge even more Death Shadows. So that's the main combo in the deck, but then of course we have a lot of other self-mill aspects to the deck to fuel our graveyard and to get those Death Shadows in there. So let's take a look at the entire deck, starting out with 4 copies of Birds of Paradise, because on the one hand we are playing lots of 3-drops in the deck, we also need some mana fixing, and we also want to have a high creature count in order to benefit from a lot of creatures being in the graveyard. So Birds of Paradise does all those things, as well as being an evasive body where we can actually scavenge onto the Birds of Paradise and then have a 13-powered evasive creature to kill the opponent with. Then we also have 2 copies of Elvish Mystic, just as an additional mana dork, not as good as Birds of Paradise, but he'll do the job. Of course, if you have a bigger budget, you can also play Noble Hierarch in this slot. Then we get to Boneyard Wurm, one of our many payoff cards for having lots of creatures in the graveyard, since Boneyard Wurm's power and toughness are each equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. Typically we won't be able to play the Boneyard Wurm on turn 2 unless we play the Death Shadow on turn 1, and of course Death Shadow on turn 1 means it just goes to the graveyard right away. So if we do that, then we can play Boneyard Wurm as a 1/1, but typically Boneyard Wurm is just an efficient play later in the game. Also, if Boneyard Wurm is in our graveyard, then the power and toughness is still equal to the number of creatures in our graveyard, which is important for the Varolz Scavenge combo. So Boneyard Wurm with lots of creatures in the graveyard means that we get to scavenge for just 2 mana and add a lot of +1/+1 counters on our creature. Next up we have Satyr Wayfinder, which is an important piece of the puzzle, since not only is it a creature to increase our creature count in the deck, but it also fuels our graveyard, since when the Satyr enters the battlefield, we get to reveal the top 4 cards, then choose a land card from those 4 and put the rest in our graveyard, which is where we want our cards to go. Then we also have 3 copies of Tracker's Instincts, which does a similar thing to the Satyr Wayfinder in that for 2 mana it fuels our graveyard, but instead of searching for a land, this searches for a creature among the top 4 cards and the rest goes to the graveyard. But it also has Flashback for 2 and a blue, which means that if we incidentally mill a Tracker's Instinct with one of our other effects, then we still get some value later in the game from the Flashback. And then we also have 2 copies of Grisly Salvage, which does a similar thing in that it looks at the top 5 cards and we can choose a creature or land card and put the rest in our graveyard. Then we get to some of our 3-mana engines. We've got 4 copies of Splinterfright, which is a star with power and toughness equal to the number of creatures in our graveyard, so similar to our Boneyard Wurm, but Splinterfright also has Trample, and at the beginning of our upkeep we get to put the top 2 cards of our library into our graveyard, so Splinterfright will fuel itself and keep milling more and more cards, and hopefully hit a lot of creatures to increase its power and toughness, and of course it goes well with a lot of the other cards in our deck. And in a similar vein we have Nyx Weaver, which is a 3-mana 2/3 with reach, and at the beginning of our upkeep we get to put the top 2 cards of our library into our graveyard, so the same thing as the Splinterfright, and we can also pay 3, exile Nyx Weaver and return target card from our graveyard to our hand in case we need a very specific card at some point, but most importantly it provides a creature that fuels our graveyard. And then of course we've got 4 copies of Varolz the Scar Striped, which is one of the key pieces in the deck. That's why we're playing 4 copies, as well as running 2 copies of Jarad's Orders, which is a 4 mana sorcery that lets us search our library for up to 2 creature cards. Then we get to put one of those into our hand and the other one in the graveyard, and the obvious combo there is that we're gonna search up Varolz and Death Shadow. We put Varolz into our hand and Death Shadow into our graveyard, and then the following turn we can start scavenging. And then finally we have 3 copies of Sidisi, which is a 4 mana 3/3 that when she enters the battlefield or attacks, we get to put the top 3 cards of our library into our graveyard. And then separate from the first ability, whenever 1 or more creature cards are put into our graveyard from our library, we get to make a 2/2 zombie creature token. So that means that if we mill over a creature with Sidisi, we get to make a 2/2, but also if we mill over a card with Nyx Weaver, Splinterfright, Satyr Wayfinder, Tracker's Instinct, Grisly Salvage, even with Jarad's Orders, we get to make a 2/2 zombie token because we put a creature from our library into our graveyard. So Sidisi will spawn a lot of zombies and is a way for us to go wide on the board. Then our mana base is far from perfect, but of course we're playing on a budget, so we're not playing any fetch lands here. Instead we're playing 4 Blooming Marsh, 3 Botanical Sanctum, 2 forests and 2 swamps, and then 2 Llanowar Wastes and 3 Yavimaya Coast as pain lands, and then 4 copies of Opulent Palace, which is a nice 3-color land, but of course enters battlefield tapped, and then also 2 Overgrown Tomb to add both green and black. So that's our mana base, and then taking a quick look at our sideboard, which is kind of a work in progress. We've got 1 copy of Laboratory Maniac, which can be an alternate win condition by milling ourselves out without us requiring to attack with our creatures. This can come in matchups where our opponent is bringing in a lot of graveyard hate, where we might not be able to exploit the scavenge ability from Varolz, but instead we just have to rely on our creatures milling ourselves out, and then Laboratory Maniac winning us the game when we fail to draw a card from our library. Then we have 2 copies of Duress, which can come in against combo and control decks, also fine against burn. Then we have 1 fairy here that we can discard from our hand in order to exile 2 cards from a graveyard, so this is great against any graveyard-based decks, and it's also a creature that goes to the graveyard to fuel our various synergies, and of course we can also search it up with Jarad's Orders because it is a creature. Then we have 1 copy of Vengeful Pharaoh, which is a pretty interesting card. So whenever we're dealt damage by one of the opponent's creatures, if Vengeful Pharaoh was in our graveyard, we get to destroy one of those attacking creatures and put Vengeful Pharaoh on top of our library. So this is great against any matchup where the opponent has just a few large creatures. And then of course milling the Vengeful Pharaoh once it's back on top of our library with cards like Nyx Weaver or Splinterfright means that we get to reuse the Vengeful Pharaoh over and over again. And we can also search it up with Jarad's Orders and put it into our graveyard right away. Then we have 3 copies of Gnaw to the Bone, which is great against any burn deck or a very aggressive strategy where we need to gain a bunch of life, and of course also has a flashback, so even if we mill it we can still get a use out of it. And also 1 copy of Reclamation Sage, which is a way to deal with artifacts or enchantments that we can also search up with Jarad's Orders. 2 copies of Creeping Corrosion against various artifact-based decks. Then 2 copies of Abrupt Decay, which is a pretty versatile card that can deal with opposing graveyard hate cards as well as just dealing with opposing creatures. And also 2 copies of Nihil Spellbomb, which is a way for us to deal with opposing graveyard decks without having to exile our own graveyard. So that's the deck. Now let's jump into some games and see how the deck does. Alright, we're on the draw. Let's take a look at our opener, which looks quite good. We've got both parts of our combo here, an Accelerant and a Nyx Weaver, so definitely a keep. Let's see what our opponent is up to. Watery Grave, untapped. Is this a hand disruption spell or a Thought Scour? It looks like a Thought Scour kind of effect. Let's run out a bird and say go. Our opponent did not spend their 1 mana, so that's pretty interesting. So they might be on a Death Shadow deck and they just wanted to take 2 damage, as we see a Street Wraith as well, which is probably their draw step, otherwise they would have cycled to maybe find a 1 mana spell last turn. And there's an Opt, which they must have drawn from the Street Wraith. So we do get to run out Varolz here, which is pretty exciting, unless of course they Fatal Push the bird here. Instead it's an Inquisition, so I guess they'll be Inquisitioning the Varolz. But that still leaves us with the Nyx Weaver we can play. And they do in fact take the Varolz. Blooming Marsh the draw, not really what we were looking for, but I guess we still run it out despite giving our opponent some extra information, just so it doesn't come into play tapped. Play out Nyx Weaver, and say go. And we could use Nyx Weaver's ability here at some point to maybe get back the Varolz. We'll see. Thought Scour from the opponent. And a Lightning Bolt on Nyx Weaver. Alright, so no self-milling for us, and we're down to a Death Shadow and 3 lands, which is quite unfortunate, since we don't have a lot of action here. Looks like the opponent might have a Tasigur here they want to play, or a Gurmag Angler. 5/5, and draw step is actually pretty good here, Tracker's Instinct. Let's play that. Elvish Mystic, Death Shadow, and Sidisi. So let's take the Sidisi, play a tapped Opulent Palace, and say go. I don't think we want to be running out the Death Shadow here, as we might be able to cast it as a creature. And then next turn, if our opponent doesn't have another Thoughtseize, we can run out Sidisi and make some zombies to start chumping the 5/5. Gurmag Angler gets in there. We'll definitely take it here. And the follow-up is a 2/2 Death Shadow. Alright, and a Varolz. So if our opponent actually doesn't have any removal spells, they're just dead here, since we get to play Varolz, Scavenge or Death Shadow onto Birds of Paradise, and attack for lethal. But if they do have a Fatal Push or Lightning Bolt, then, or Terminate, then doing this is a pretty risky line. Might be better off just running out Sidisi, and then setting up the kill for next turn maybe when the opponent's more tapped out. So they might be saving a removal spells for Sidisi, which would work out in our favor, given that we have the Varolz. Could also play out Varolz and Scavenge onto Varolz himself. That way a Lightning Bolt or Fatal Push wouldn't be able to deal with Varolz, since we can regenerate by sacking the bird. But if they have Terminate, that prevents regeneration, so that wouldn't work. So all in all, I think it's probably worth to run out Sidisi here, and then make them use their removal on Sidisi rather than on Varolz. Sidisi triggers. Do they respond? They do not. So we do get a zombie here. They might have some Stubborn Denials, which don't do much. They're gonna fetch down to 9 to grow the Death Shadow. Ideally they just tap out and we get to kill them with Varolz next turn. Instead it's gonna be a Snapcaster, probably a Lightning Bolt on Sidisi. I doubt they will Inquisition us. And they do in fact kill Sidisi. Opponent goes to combat. They have 1 mana left, so their last card has to be a Fatal Push for them to not die to Varolz, or they need to have an Inquisition in their second main phase. So right now we would be taking 9 down to 6, but that would also make our Death Shadow quite appealing, so I'm actually pretty happy just taking 9 here, down to 6, and then we still have Death Shadow plus Varolz plus a zombie token for next turn, should things not work out. Opponent passes, so we can play Varolz, scavenge the Death Shadow and play out the Death Shadow while still being able to attack with the bird if we play out the Swamp. So I think that's a plan here. Play out Varolz, scavenge the Death Shadow onto the bird, and hope they don't have a Fatal Push. Move to combat, attack with the bird. Alright, sweet, that does it. On to sideboarding. So Grixis Death Shadow, we can expect Nihil Spellbombs from the opponent. We might be interested in those ourselves, as they can deal with Snapcaster targets as well as making their Delve creatures worse. They might also have some Lilianas that we need to take care of, which is where Abrupt Decay might be an option. Duress could also take care of some of their removal spells, which we might be interested in. Can also take a Spellbomb if we get to cast it at some point early. The Faerie can also deal with Snapcaster targets, but overall is I think weaker than Spellbomb. And Vengeful Pharaoh can also be quite good, as it gets to destroy one of the opponent's creatures. And a 5/4 Death Touch is also pretty good. So what do we take out? I think I like taking out some mana dorks, since our opponent's gonna have perhaps Liliana Last Hope. They might have some cheap removal for it, the game might get grindy, and those mana dorks are bad top decks. Boneyard Wurm could be a liability against spell bombs. Splinterfrights might also be a liability against spell bomb. So I like shaving a couple of those. So right now we can bring in 6 cards. If we want to bring in all 7, we need to cut 1 more, just leaving in 1. And then bringing in all this. Could also see not bringing in some of these sideboard cards and maybe keep a few Splinterfrights. Perhaps the Abrupt Decays are not necessary, and we can just have a few extra Splinterfrights. But they are quite bad against spell bombs, since they just die on the spot and the opponent gets to draw a card. This way we don't have any of those creatures besides the 1 Splinterfright. So I think we try it like this. And this hand is quite weak to a removal spell on the birds. If the bird survives, then we get to Satyr Wayfinder, look for a land. If the bird dies and we don't hit a second land, then this hand's quite bad, of course. The opponent might also have Hand Disruption turn 1, taking the bird. But I think overall this is still an okay hand, just because Satyr Wayfinder is very good in the matchup. So I'm willing to take a risk here. I don't count on the bird surviving, but I just hope that we draw a second land in our first couple draws. Alright, Varolz, not what we need here, but we'll still run out the birds. Bloodstained Mire, getting Watery Grave, and that's a Thought Scour, just milling over 2 lands. So that's still fine. Swamp the play. Can we dodge a Fatal Push here? No, we can't. It's a nice promo Fatal Push as well. And now we have to hope for a second land. And a Tasigur as well, so yeah, we're gonna need that second land real quick. Alright, we got there. It's not a black source, but at least we get to play Wayfinder and hopefully find another land here. And we bricked, that's not good. But at least we put 5 creatures in the graveyard as well as a Tracker's Instincts. Polluted Delta from the opponent. And Tasigur's gonna get in there. And a Thoughtseize, which might take our other Wayfinder here, as currently our black spells are uncastable. Instead they took the Varolz, maybe traumatized by last game. Delta for a Blood Crypt, which comes into play untapped. Death Shadow as a 1/1. And our opponent passes. Alright, Tracker's Instincts. I think I would rather run out the Wayfinder and hope to hit a land. Alright, there's a Blooming Marsh, which will take over the swamp. And I think we'll just Duress the opponents, since Death Shadow doesn't do much here. Opponent's gonna Thought Scour in response, and we get to take a Terminate, but they still have a Gurmag Angler, which they will be able to cast next turn. So we're definitely in a bit of trouble here. This is where we wish one of these was a Splinterfright. So maybe over sideboarded a little bit. But we have a few chum blockers here. Tasigur gets in. I don't think we need to chum block quite yet, as this also turns on our own Death Shadow. And now we'll see the Gurmag Angler. Nope, our opponent's gonna hold on to whatever spells they have. And another Tracker's Instincts. So we could flashback the Tracker's Instincts from the graveyard, but I think we just want to cast one from hand in case we find a Birds of Paradise, which we could still cast. And we find just a Nyx Weaver. Spellbomb and Jarad's Orders gets milled. So we could run out our own Death Shadow here, and I think we will, over playing out the Duress. Also not interested in attacking into the Death Shadow here. So we'll pass a turn. Alright, looks like our opponent had a Kolaghan's Command, which is why they didn't play out the Angler. And yeah, we'll have to discard a card here. And I think we'll discard the Duress, since I don't see ourselves using that anytime soon with our opponent being empty-handed. They're probably just gonna play out whatever spell they draw. or use it in response of the Duress. Opponent did find a fetch land, so now they can start attacking with their Death Shadow. So I think we just take it still. Opponent can pump this up to 4-4, we would take 8 down to 4. And then they still have the Gurmag Angler we know about. It's not good for us, but I would rather block the Gurmag Angler. They are in fact gonna fetch. Do they also shock? They do. I think Varolz is probably our best draw, since then if our opponent attacks with all 3 creatures next turn, we can triple block, regenerate Varolz, and then kill them on the way back. So that wouldn't be an option for the opponent. Instead we find the birds, which does keep us alive, but also forces us to just chum block here. I guess we'll cast the Tracker's Instinct in case we find a Death Shadow. And we do. Alright, I guess we're just playing out the Death Shadow here. Which is a nice 9-9, which does kill the opponent, so they have to be careful if they attack. Serum Visions. And looks like they're keeping at least 1 card on top. So that's also not great for us. 2 cards on top in fact. And Kolaghan's Command on our Satyr Wayfinder is just gonna kill us here. Can discard, I guess we discard the Nyx Weaver. In case we draw land, we can go birds plus Tracker's Instincts. But yeah, our opponent can safely attack with everyone here. And we're dead. Alright, on to game 3, where perhaps we want the Splinterfright over maybe the Duress. Still don't really want the Elvish Mystic that much. 1 Duress should be plenty. And Decay, didn't really see any targets there from the opponent, but I imagine they have some Lilianas or their own Spellbombs, which we might be able to snipe when we're on the play. And Abrupt Decay of course also deals with Death Shadow. Wanna be on the play. Alright, this hand's okay. We've got some acceleration, some way to fuel the graveyard, and Tracker's Instinct hopefully to find us some action. So let's lead with a bird. We don't really mind if this gets killed, although it is currently our only blue source. Inquisition, if they take the Tracker's Instincts we can just flash it back next turn, which would be nice. And they do take the Tracker's Instincts. And Sidisi is a nice draw, so now we just get to flash back Tracker's Instincts. And find either birds or a Nyx Weaver. We'll take the Nyx Weaver. Say go. And if our bird survives, and if they don't have another hand disruption spell, that's a lot of ifs of course, we do get to resolve Sidisi. And it's gonna be a Thoughtseize, taking away our Sidisi. I guess we'll just follow up with a Nyx Weaver next turn. Alright, our opponent misses their second land drop though, so that's something to keep track of. Now let's just play the land the opponent knows about and play out Nyx Weaver. And say go. Of course, opponent missing land drops means they have a lot of spells. And we're kind of flooding out, so that's not great. Serum Vision's probably what they drew here, since I can't really imagine they would spend a turn Thoughtseizing just to get rid of 1 unknown card, since Nyx Weaver is not really a particularly threatening card, which means they probably don't have a second land. In fact, they don't. Nyx Weaver starts milling, reveals Varolz, and we find a Jarad's Orders. Alright, that's exciting. So we can Jarad's Orders for Varolz and Death Shadow. Of course, if they have another hand disruption spell, they just get to take Varolz, but we still have our Nyx Weaver to get Varolz back, potentially. So I think I'm okay playing out the Orders here. Could also consider putting the Vengeful Pharaoh in the graveyard, but I think it's a little too early for that. Our opponent hasn't presented a creature yet. Splinterfright would also be okay, but then I would rather just have the combo of Varolz plus Death Shadow. So yeah, let's just take the Varolz, put a Death Shadow in the graveyard, And attack for 2, I guess. Could also consider not attacking. I wouldn't really mind if our opponent plays out a Death Shadow, since that ties up one of their mana, and they're pretty pinched on mana here. So let's hope to dodge another Inquisition or Thoughtseize. Another Serum Visions from the opponent, which they might have kept on top with their first Serum Visions, or perhaps it's the card they drew off of the first Serum Visions. Alright, they did find a land. Can probably take a look at what they kept on top. So they topped both, and last turn they top-bottomed. So I'm not entirely sure which card they kept on top with the first Serum Visions. Maybe a second Serum Visions or just a fetch land. They are going to fetch, and they do need to interact here, otherwise they're dead. And they do in fact have a Gurmag Angler, and actually the opponent's just dead here since the birds has evasion, so we can just scavenge onto the birds and kill our opponent. Alright, sweet. We got a victory. I don't think our opponent has Slaughter Pact, and they wouldn't be able to pay for it either, so let's scavenge onto the birds. Move to combat. And there we go, sweet. Managed to beat Grixis Death Shadow with our Sultai Selfmill deck. On to the next one. Alright, we're on the draw, but unfortunately our hand is basically 6 lands, since Wayfinder finds a land, Death Shadow doesn't do anything by itself, so I think this is a pretty easy mulligan. And this hand looks pretty good, so we'll keep. And another Splinterfright, I think we can bottom that. We would rather find another land here. Opponent fetches right away. For a tomb, could be a Thoughtseize or an Inquisition here. Instead it's a Noble Hierarch. Interesting. So still could be an Abzan deck, but we'll know more next turn, while we're just gonna play out our bird here. So next turn we can play out our Nyx Weaver, and then we can follow up with hopefully Sidisi. Windswept Heath also indicates perhaps an Abzan deck. Getting a Plains and a Voice of Resurgence, which we don't really care about, into another Noble Hierarch. Alright, so don't really mind this start from the opponent. So here we can just run out our Yavimaya Coast and play out Nyx Weaver. And start fueling our graveyard. And then we can follow up with Sidisi, which in combination with Nyx Weaver is also quite nice. And then hopefully we'll have some creatures in the graveyard for our Splinterfright. Opponent has 5 mana at their disposal. They get in with a 4/4 Voice thanks to Exalted. And we'll just have to take the 4 here. And a Lingering Souls. So this looks like an Abzan kind of aggro style deck. Voice is not always a main deck inclusion in Abzan, but we'll see. So let's yield to this and see what the Nyx Weaver gets. At least 1 creature, that's good. So now we could play out Splinterfright if we wanted to. I could also see just running out to Sidisi, getting a 2/2 right away. If our opponent has a removal, it's probably a Path to Exile that they didn't want to use on the birds or a Nyx Weaver, otherwise we probably would have seen a Fatal Push. Do we run out Sidisi into a potential Path to Exile, or would we rather play birds plus Splinterfright first? I think the upside is quite high for Sidisi, makes a bunch of zombies here to block the Voice as well. So I think we'll just run out Sidisi here. And then hopefully hit a creature with this trigger. We did not. Found a Jarad's Orders, Grisly Salvage and a land, so that's quite unfortunate. So I guess we'll just have to pass a turn here. On the bright side, we do have a Nyx Weaver, which can block the Lingering Souls tokens, unless of course only 1 attacks and then they have Exalted. So we might see a Path to Exile here on the Sidisi. Instead, just 1 Spirit attacking, so we'll just take 3. Stirring Wildwood from the opponent. Could see a flashback Lingering Souls. And instead, our opponent cast a Maelstrom Pulse, but it looks like they actually misclicked and targeted their own Noble Hierarch rather than perhaps our Sidisi. So that's pretty unfortunate. but I guess we'll take it. So Nyx Weaver mills 2, reveals a creature, so we'll get a zombie from Sidisi. And Opulent Palace to draw. So yeah, I think we just have to play out Splinterfright. And then play out another bird, since it's never bad to have more mana available. So now we can generate quite a few zombies with Sidisi if she survives another turn. There's a Kitchen Sphinx from the opponent, gaining them 2 life, that's fine. No attacks, and now we get a bunch of triggers. And let's heal to this as well. Alright, so only got 1 zombie here from our 2 triggers. Put a Nyx Weaver in a graveyard and drew another Sidisi. So it could be okay to start attacking with our Sidisi here, trading it for some of the opponent's creatures and then just replaying a second Sidisi. Or we could just play a Splinterfright, which would also be fine here. And the upside of playing the Sidisi is that we get a trigger from attacking as well as from replaying one. So I think we just attack with our Sidisi to try to fuel our graveyard some more. And then we can play the second Sidisi, since I expect this one to die. Revealed 3 cards, Death Shadow one among them, making us another zombie. Opponent doesn't need trade. Kitchen Sphinx persists. And then in our second main phase we actually also milled over a Tracker's Instinct, which we could play. Playing out Sidisi is probably just better here, since that way we get the Nyx Weaver and Splinterfright, potentially making some more zombies. And we do indeed get another zombie. Alright, so let's pass a turn. Splinterfright now a 6/6, gets Abrupt Decay, but we luckily have another one. If at any point we find a Varolz, this game is gonna be over. And there we go, find a Varolz, who have a lot of zombies at the ready. So let's just play out a Varolz here. And we can scavenge onto a Birds of Paradise. Of course our opponent still has that Lingering Souls, so it would be nice to scavenge onto a Splinterfright. But then if our opponent has a path for Varolz, that's pretty awkward. So I guess we do just scavenge onto a Birds of Paradise here. So do that, tap this for black, and make a 13-powered Birds of Paradise. And then we can start attacking with the bird, and I'll send in a few zombies as well, and our opponent just scoops it up here to save some time. So an unfortunate misclick from the opponent, but that's how it goes. So on to sideboarding. Don't mind Vengeful Pharaoh against this kind of deck, although it's not great against Lingering Souls. We still get to choose which creature we destroy, so that means they have to just attack with the Lingering Souls tokens to avoid dying to the Pharaoh. We also need to bring in some hate for the opposing hate. I think the opponent's probably going to have a few Nihil Spellbombs that they're going to bring in, Scavenging Ooze as well. So Abrupt Decay seems like a good answer to those. Don't think we need our own Nihil Spellbombs. So that looks good. So we just need to make 3 cuts here. I could see shaving a Boneyard Wurm. Can probably take out both Boneyard Wurms at this point, as they're not great against Lingering Souls. Maybe we do just shave a Death Shadow and try something like this. Alright, our opening hand looks pretty good. We could run out the Death Shadow turn 1, but I'd rather develop our mana and play the Elvish Mystic. Opponent with a tapped Godless Shrine, so no hand disruption turn 1. Another Death Shadow to draw. Glad we shaved 1 copy, since drawing too many copies at the start is not great, since it's really just a combo piece and not a creature you can rely on casting. Fatal Push on the Elvish Mystic. So let's just keep developing our mana here with the Satyr Wayfinder, hopefully find a land. And unfortunately we brick, find 2 birds, a Nyx Weaver and Abrupt Decay. That's unfortunate, but at least We filled up our graveyard, so hopefully we draw some lands here in the coming turns, otherwise we might be in trouble. Kitchen things, that's fine. And another Wayfinder, alright, let's try that again. And alright, now we did find some lands. So we have the option between Forest and Yavimaya Coast. We already have our blue mana covered, so I think I would rather have the Painless land. Can play that out as well and pass a turn. So next turn we could be flashing back a Tracker's Instinct from the graveyard. If our opponent attacks here, I'm not opposed to just double blocking the Kitchen Finks. Is this a Siege Rhino? Nope. It's a Wiltleaf Liege instead. So our opponent now has a 5-powered Kitchen Finks. So on the one hand we could let the damage through to grow our Death Shadows, but I think for now I would rather just block it and prevent 5 damage while we maybe set up with our Tracker's Instincts. So yeah, let's just chump this and not take 5. Birds of Paradise, not bad, so rather than flashing back Tracker's Instinct, we can just play a Tracker's Instinct and play the birds. So let's start by playing out a Tracker's Instinct. Finds a Splinterfright, another Tracker's Instinct and 2 lands. And then we'll play out the bird. Say go. So the opponent has some very large creatures in play, but if we can make some chump blockers with Sidisi, we could be okay. Another Liege from the opponent. Now a 7-powered Kitchen Finks and a 6-powered Liege. So we could take 13, go to 7, play 2 Death Shadows. Of course, that instantly loses to a Maelstrom Pulse, and is also not great against a single removal spell because then our opponent has 3 potentially lethal creatures. So I think we just chump here, take 6, and play it safe. Alright, land is not bad. So Splinterfright right now is 7/7, that's pretty big. So we could run out Splinterfright here, plus keep up Abrupt Decay, or we can run out Sidisi and make a chump blocker, but then we're still gonna take a bunch of damage. I think I would rather play the Splinterfright first. Opponent likely has a path to exile, but then we still get to Abrupt Decay the Finks, take 12, and then we have 2 giant Death Shadows on the following turn. I guess that's our best bet here. So sure, let's run out the Wastes, and I don't think we want to take damage here despite having the Shadows. So let's pay for colorless, a green, and I guess another green. Play the Splinterfrights. So let's just pass it back. Do we see an end of turn path? We do not. Instead it's an Abrupt Decay, which happens. And a Lingering Souls, which is also going to be a problem here, as they're 3/3 tokens now. So opponent attacks us for a whole lot. So if we Abrupt Decay the Kitchen Finks, our opponent's still going to have plenty of lethal threats next turn. But if we chump with the birds, then we're down a mana, so we would not be able to cast both Sidisi and Death Shadow. I think we're pretty dead here regardless. Let's just Abrupt Decay the Finks. That persists. And then we'll take 12. But then we're still dead to the spirit tokens. Blooming Marsh, the draw, is not gonna do it. So yeah, I think we'll just concede here. Move on to the last game. Do we want to change anything? Opponent does have quite a few graveyard interactions with Lingering Souls and Kitchen Finks. Might want to consider the Faerie, but I don't think it's where we want to be. So yeah, I think we just run it back and try to be a little faster. We would like to be on the play, and this hand looks acceptable. I mean, doesn't have a ton of things going on. It's basically just 2 mana dorks, Sidisi, and a bunch of lands. But the mana dorks are the kind of thing we need for this hand to be explosive, and we just need to draw something like a Tracker's Instinct or any of our graveyard fueling cards. So I think we probably have to keep this one. And then I guess we'll lead with the Elvish Mystic in case they have a fatal push. I would rather have them kill the Mystic than the birds, but mana base wise I don't think it makes a huge difference. Alright, let's lead with Overgrown Tomb. Play out Elvish Mystic. Say go. Opponent has the Overgrown Tomb. Do they have a fatal push? They do. Alright, so glad we played Mystic first. Another palace is not what we need here, so we'll just play out the birds and say go. Would not mind our opponent having an Inquisition here, since that wouldn't take anything. But I don't think our opponent's running any hand disruption, or at least not a ton of it. Alright, so we do get to play Sidisi. Our opponent still has white mana up, so they could have a path to exile potentially in response to the trigger, in which case we would not be getting a zombie even if we reveal one. Other option is just playing out Varolz with the birds to kind of protect it. I think we have to go with the high upside play of Sidisi here and try to get lucky and just hope our opponent doesn't have the removal spell. So let's yield. And doesn't look like the opponent has a path in response, and we did reveal a Wayfinder, granting us a zombie token, so that's nice. So they did have the path, but they did not respond to the trigger, so I guess we got a free zombie token out of the deal. Get a forests and a kitchen finks from the opponent. Birds the draw, not great. So we can play Varolz, don't have a ton of fuel in the graveyard. We would just be adding 1/1/1 counter to any of our creatures. But I guess we'll just play out the Varolz anyways. Since we have protection, we can just sacrifice any of our creatures to regenerate it. I don't think we want to be attacking with our zombie. So let's play Varolz and say go. Want to keep some of our creatures in the graveyard in case we draw something like a Splinterfright, in which case we don't want to deplete the graveyard. But at some point we might start scavenging here. 4 mana, is this a Liege? No, Noble Hierarch. And does the Kitchen Finks attack? It does, for 4. I think we'll take it for now. And just a land to draw, unfortunately. So we could scavenge the Wayfinder onto a bird, but then we're just getting in for 1, that's not that exciting. Could scavenge onto a zombie token, that way we can trade with the Kitchen Finks. So I think we'll just scavenge the Wayfinder here onto the zombie token and pass the turn. Should have played our Opulent Palace there, of course, in case we find a Tracker's Instinct and need all our mana. Opponent attacks. I think we'll trade. The Finks persists. Don't want to see a Gavany Township here, that would be annoying. Instead it's a Rest in Peace, which is not great since we don't have the Abrupt Decay to deal with it. I guess on the bright side we did not have a lot of things in our graveyard to begin with. But that definitely shuts off quite a few cards in our deck. Also shuts off a few cards in the opponent's deck, like Kitchen Finks and Lingering Souls. But it's definitely worse for our deck. So let's play out a Nyx Weaver. And I guess we'll play out a land, even though there could be some advantage to keeping a card in hand, especially if our opponent does have some sort of hand disruption in their deck. And they do attack with the Kitchen Finks, so we could trade here with either the Nyx Weaver or the Varolz, which could be a thing we're interested in. I think we want to keep the Nyx Weaver in case of Lingering Souls. Could also just block with Varolz, regenerate it by sacking a bird. Let's go to blockers. And then sacrifice a bird to regenerate Varolz. That works. And no more plays from the opponent. So now we're just exiling 2 cards. And alright, Jarad's Orders is interesting. Can get us any card from our library. Certainly the kind of card we're looking for here. Let's take a look at what we can get. So let's see here. So Sidisi is not gonna work against Rest in Peace. We did not bring in our Reclamation Sage, which is a card we could have gotten to blow up the Rest in Peace here. Death Shadow could be a thing, since we do have this Yavimaya Coast, which we could use to damage ourselves and grow the Death Shadow. Splinterfright, of course, doesn't do much. Varolz is not great. Could get a Vengeful Pharaoh just as a 5/4 Death Touch creature. That might actually be pretty decent. So let's put that into our hand. And then put a card we don't want to draw into our graveyard, which I think our worst card is probably just Elvish Mystic. So let's put that into the graveyard. And then don't have enough mana here to cast the Pharaoh, so we'll just attack with our Varolz and our Spider. Opponent takes it, and we'll say go. Did not expect our opponent to have a Rest in Peace, to be honest. Usually Abzan doesn't really like exiling graveyards. Opponent with a Loxodon Smiter, which basically blanks our attacks and just trades with our Pharaoh, so that's not good for us. Nyx Weaver is gonna keep exiling cards from our deck, so at some point we might just mill ourselves out. Let's play out our Pharaoh. Could even consider starting to deal some damage to ourselves with the Yavimaya Coast. But for now, we'll just pass a turn and hope to draw Abrupt Decay at some point. But we already exiled one of them. Kitchen Finks for the opponent. Let's keep track of which cards we exiled, so let's go ahead and play Tracker's Instincts. And find a Death Shadow. Alright, I think that's actually one of the better cards we could find. Don't think we want another Nyx Weaver. So let's get the Death Shadow. And I don't think we're interested in attacking. We could trade a Vengeful Pharaoh for the Loxodon Smiter. But for now I like it on defense. And no attacks from the opponent. And Nyx Weaver keeps exiling, exiles Jarad's orders. Now that we have a Wastes, we can definitely consider just playing out this Death Shadow as a 1/1. And then saying go. Stirring Wildwood for the opponent. Nyx Weaver keeps exiling, exiles Sidisi. And we do not have a Laboratory Maniac, unfortunately. So I think for now we'll say go, and then we can double deal damage to ourselves with our Pain Lands, grow Death Shadow up to a 3/3, then a 5/5, and then we should have some decent attacks. End of turn, we'll take some Pain. Satyr Wayfinder, I don't think we actually want to play out the Satyr Wayfinder here, unfortunately. If they double block with Kitchen Finks and the Wildwood, then we would need 6 power to go through it, so I don't think we want to attack quite yet. I think we wait one more turn to attack with the Death Shadow. Another Wildwood is not good. End of turn, take some more damage. Forest to draw. Alright, so now I think we want to attack with the Death Shadow. Could also consider attacking with the Pharaoh, but then those would just trade, I presume. So let's attack like this. And the objective here is to get rid of the Smiter, so that our Pharaoh has better attacks. But our opponent, just with a Path to Exile, is gonna crush our dreams. Don't know if we have any basics left, we do not. We do still have an Abrupt Decay, which I think is our only out at this point. So we have to draw the Abrupt Decay before we deck ourselves. Voice of Resurgence. And still no Abrupt Decay gone. So let's just say go. Another Rest in Peace. Alright, so now we can no longer win. So maybe should have sided in Laboratory Maniac, maybe should have sided in Reclamation Sage just didn't put our opponent on having the Rest in Peace in this matchup. And Nyx Weaver is gonna mill us, and there we go. I wanna thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and as always, have a nice day. I also want to thank all my patrons for supporting the channel, and you can do so yourself as well over at patreon.com/LegenVD, where you get cool rewards for supporting the channel, as well as getting us closer to our goals, where with every goal reached we will release an additional weekly series, so if you want to see more content, Patreon is the place to go.